There is a point in most people's financial life where nothing seems to change, and then suddenly everything does, not because income explodes or luck intervenes, but because the underlying structure of money itself begins to behave differently. This shift is subtle at first, almost invisible, yet it separates two completely different financial realities, and it tends to happen somewhere between having a few $1,000s and approaching six figures. The difference between $1,000 and $100,000 is not just scale, it is a change in how money interacts with time, decisions, and psychology. At lower levels of savings, money behaves in a very linear way. You earn, you spend, and whatever remains sits almost passively. If you save $1,000, the system does not noticeably accelerate. Small returns exist, but they are too insignificant to alter perception. A 5% annual return on $1,000 produces only $50 in a year, which is not enough to feel meaningful relative to daily expenses. Because of this, saving feels disconnected from progress. The effort required to save appears much larger than the visible outcome, and this creates a psychological friction where consistency becomes difficult to maintain. This is where many people unknowingly exit the system, not because they lack discipline, but because the feedback loop is weak. Human behavior responds to visible reinforcement, and when financial progress is slow and barely noticeable, the brain categorizes it as low impact. As a result, consumption often feels more rational than saving, even when logically it is not. The system at this stage does not reward patience in a way that is emotionally convincing. As savings grow, however, the structure begins to change. At $10,000, the same 5% return becomes $500 annually. This is still not life-changing, but it starts to become visible. There is now a sense that money is contributing something on its own. The feedback loop strengthens slightly, and saving begins to feel less like pure sacrifice and more like participation in a system that produces outcomes. But the real shift occurs closer to $100,000. At this level, the same percentage returns begin to create outputs that rival active effort. A 5% return generates $5,000 annually, which starts to resemble a secondary income stream rather than a negligible bonus. The relationship between effort and reward changes. Instead of relying entirely on new income, existing money begins to carry part of the load. This is the threshold where compounding becomes psychologically real. Before this point, compounding is mostly theoretical. People understand it conceptually, but they do not experience it. After this point, the effects become observable within shorter time frames. Growth is no longer something you wait decades to notice. It begins to show up within a year, sometimes even within months, depending on market conditions. Mathematically, nothing magical has happened. The percentage remains the same. What changes is the base. Compounding is often described as exponential, but in practice, it only feels exponential after a certain threshold is reached. Below that threshold, it behaves almost invisibly, which is why so many people underestimate its importance. They are interacting with the early stage of an exponential curve, where growth is technically present, but visually flat. This creates a structural divide. Individuals below the threshold must rely primarily on active income and disciplined saving, while those above it begin to benefit from capital itself producing returns. Over time, this difference compounds not just financially, but behaviorally. When money starts generating noticeable returns, the incentive to preserve and grow it increases. Decisions become more long-term oriented, and risk is evaluated differently because there is now something substantial to protect. There is also a shift in how time is perceived. At lower levels, time feels like an obstacle because progress is slow. At higher levels, time becomes an asset because it amplifies existing capital. The same years that once felt unproductive begin to produce visible outcomes simply because the base has grown large enough to make compounding effective. Historically, this pattern has repeated across different economies and time periods. Wealth accumulation tends to accelerate after a certain point, not because individuals suddenly become more capable, but because the system begins to work in their favor. This is why early accumulation, even when it feels insignificant, plays a critical role. It is not about immediate results, but about reaching the level where the system transitions from passive to productive. The important distinction is that this threshold is not a finish line. 100,000 does not create financial independence, nor does it eliminate risk. What it does is change the rules of the game. It introduces a second engine of growth, one that operates alongside active income and gradually reduces the sole dependence on it. Understanding this shift can change how early financial stages are perceived. Instead of expecting immediate results, the focus moves toward crossing the threshold where money begins to behave differently. The early phase is not ineffective. It is simply the quiet part of an exponential system. Once that system becomes visible, the relationship with money, time, and decision-making starts to transform in a way that feels almost disproportionate to the initial effort. In the end, the gap between 1,000 and 100,000 is not just numerical. It represents a transition from a system where you work for money to one where money begins, in a limited but meaningful way, to work alongside you.